You're listening to Storytime in Paris on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and to join our book club, please join us on Patreon. Since well before Victor Hugo looked up at Notre Dame and thought, what if a hunchback lived in there? Authors have been inspired by Paris. Welcome to the Storytime in Paris podcast on Paris Underground Radio, where we keep that tradition alive by showcasing an author with a French connection in each episode. Every episode will feature 5 questions asked by you, our author's biggest fans, and answered live on air. Then our authors will treat us to a reading of an excerpt from their book. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity. Would you like to join the Storytime in Paris book club? Head on over to patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio and stay tuned to the end of this episode for more information. This week, my guest is award-winning author Michelle Wright. Michelle won the short story competition The Age, and Fine, her collection of short stories, was shortlisted for the Victorian Premier's Literary Award for an unpublished manuscript, which was then published in 2016. She was also awarded a 6-month residency at the Cité Internationale des Arts in Paris, which is where she wrote her first novel, Small Acts of Defiance. Small Acts of Defiance recounts the tale of Australian-born Lucie, who moves to Paris just before the German occupation. In a world with increasing anti-Jewish sentiment, met with increasing French indifference, and uprooted into a foreign land suddenly occupied by yet another foreign land, Lucie must discover where her own truth lies and whether small acts of defiance can make a big difference. Please allow me to introduce Michelle Wright, author of Small Acts of Defiance. Hello, Michelle. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Jennifer.
So can you start by telling us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Okay, so I am an Australian author. I originally wrote short stories. So my first book was a collection of short stories called Fine. And my most recent book is a novel called Small Acts of Defiance. I live in Melbourne, Australia, but I spent about 12 years in Paris and all, back in the 80s and 90s, and then more recently had a 6-month residency here to research Small Acts of Defiance, which is set in Nazi-occupied Paris. So I wanted to come back and refresh my memory of the architecture of Paris, and that's kind of me and my recent history in a nutshell.
What is the transition like from short story writing to writing a full novel?
Terrifying. I think I'm a more natural short story writer, but I was offered a 2-book contract with a big Australian publisher, and so when they said, look, we'd love to publish short stories, but the second book has to be a novel, I said, yeah, sure, no problem, I can do that. And then spent years, really, it's a completely different craft, a completely different format. So it was a big learning experience for me. Luckily, I have a fantastic editor. My Australian editor was really fabulous, and the big structural edit I did, I learned a lot from looking at her suggestions. But it's a big beast, a novel to keep in your head when you're a short story writer, and you're used to being able to hold a whole story in your head at one time. Spend an hour at lunchtime, or in breaks from work, editing a whole story. It's a very different story when you're talking about 100,000 words that you have to, try and remember actually the story yourself. And, there's subplots and multiple characters and stuff. So it was a big and difficult transition for me. And I'm still learning, I'll be learning a lot more, I think, even with my second novel.
It spans 5 years. Did you know how it would end when you started it?
No, I didn't. I mean, obviously, because it is the story of Nazi-occupied Paris, there's the historical facts that we know about how things ended, and obviously you don't play around with historical, reality. But as far as the destiny of the main characters, no, I wasn't absolutely sure what would happen until right at the end. In fact, it was the last thing I wrote was the ending, which isn't always the case. Some people have the ending in mind or even write the ending, before they get there. But no, it was the last scene I wrote and rewrote several times.
Interesting. And so can you tell our listeners a little bit about Small Acts of Defiance, about the plot of the story?
Yeah. So look, as the title suggests, it's the story of French people living through the German occupation of Paris, but it's about the small acts of defiance. It's about ordinary people. It's not the story of a resistance hero or heroine or a woman who has an affair with a Nazi officer. It's not. It's really focusing on ordinary people and how they reacted to what they saw happening around them during those 4 years of Nazi occupation, and the actions that they decided to take, mainly small, some a little larger, but mainly small acts. And it's really revolves around the question of what is the place of personal responsibility when you're faced with a huge, dramatic situation like a war or the occupation by a foreign power. What does each individual do? What can they do? What is the power of individual action? Is symbolic resistance enough? Should you resort to violence to respond to violence? So it's really asking all those questions. The characters decide to answer them for themselves, but it's not offering really any answers about what the correct response is to a situation like that. But it was something I wanted to explore just from the point of view of an ordinary young woman. So the protagonist is Lucie, a young woman who was brought up in Australia, but her mother is French. So she has a connection to France without having ever lived in Paris. But through tragic circumstances, she arrives back in Paris in January 1940. So just war has been declared, but it's the phony war. The Germans haven't invaded Paris yet or France yet. And then very quickly the situation changes, becomes dramatic. And Lucie, given that she has never lived in France, is discovering as a young 16, 17-year-old, coming to understand French society, French history, French culture, French anti-Semitism, and hopefully the reader then is accompanying her on her discovery as she ages and matures and becomes more aware and starts to kind of make those big choices about who she is and what she stands for and what she believes in and what she'll do faced with what she's seeing happening around her.
Fabulous. So this book begins in 1940 and moves through to 1945. Can you talk a little bit about what drew you to this time period and the research that you did to bring it to life in your book?
Yeah. Well, look, I started writing the novel in 2017. So I had a residency through the Australia Council for the Arts, a 6-month residency in the International City of the Arts in Paris. But the seeds had really been planted way back in the 80s. I arrived in Paris in 85 and spent a little while here and then came back to live and settle in 86. So the Second World War, that might seem a long time after the Second World War, but it's as close to the end of the war as the 80s are to us now. It wasn't ancient history at all. It was certainly in the living memory of a lot of Parisians, or certainly their parents. And I noticed very quickly that to bring up the subject of what had happened during the war and what people had done during the war was very sensitive. It was very difficult to speak to people about what had happened. This was at a time when there hadn't been a lot written or filmed about the collaboration that had gone on during the war. It was in 1995, Jacques Chirac apologised and recognised the contribution of the French state and the French police in the deportation of Jews, but that was the first time, 50 years after the war, that had happened. So way back in the 80s, it was something that really intrigued me and I felt needed to be explored. And then decades went on, I wrote other things, but this was always in my mind. And when I was applying for the residency in Paris, it made sense that this would be the project that I would propose, that I would research while I was here. And they accepted that. So even though I had, through those 12 years of living in Paris, I had a fairly good understanding of what had happened during that period of occupation. And I'd really come to understand French society and culture pretty deeply. I really needed to do some really thorough and specific research during that residency. And luckily, I don't know if your listeners know where the Cité Internationale des Arts is in the 4th arrondissement, but my studio was right next door to the Mémorial de la Shoah.
Oh.
So the Holocaust Memorial. So I spent a lot of time there. They have amazing permanent collection and archives, letters written from people. So because I'm not Jewish myself, so I have to be very, very careful and sensitive when, even though my protagonist is not Jewish, there are other characters in the book that are Jewish and who are deported. So I really needed to do some very thorough research into what had actually happened. So I haven't made anything up in the novel. All the references to historical events are true. The characters are combinations of various historical people I came across, and I've renamed them, but I haven't made anything up. I really wanted to respect the historical truth there. So So that's the kind of path, that the long path that led to me writing this novel.
That's very interesting. I think you answered this a little bit already, but Lucie is half French and half Australian.
Yeah.
And she's raised in Australia. And in fact, the first time that she comes to France is shortly before this German occupation. Can you talk a little bit about why you decided to make her an immigrant instead of a native French person as your main character?
Yeah. Well, I think, as I said, I really wanted my readers to, having in mind English-speaking readers and especially Australian and American readers who have a little bit of knowledge about what happened in France during the Second World War, but perhaps don't know all the intricacies of daily life of Parisians, and also what the French state, the Vichy regime, had their collaboration. A lot of English-speaking readers probably wouldn't be across the details of all of that. And so I really wanted a foreign protagonist, but who speaks French, so that we can have the action all happening in French, but who is discovering, understanding, French politics, the very complex French politics of the 30s and 40s, the whole history of France, of anti-Semitism in France, and the French society and class structure and the layout of Paris and the very specific areas where there was a strong Jewish concentration and more upper class concentration. And so I wanted her to be discovering that as she spends time in Paris, and hopefully the reader will also be learning along with her, without it having to be too expository and too didactic. Without having to lay all that out as a preamble for the readers. I hopefully have been able to weave that through the action, so that people are discovering, as Lucie discovers, through her eyes, they're coming to an understanding of the situation. Also, on a personal level, even though I've spent 12 years in France, I'm very aware that I'm not French, I'm not Jewish, and so this is not my story. And so I didn't want to have either a French protagonist or a Jewish protagonist. I thought it would be better for me to respect my status as an outsider and translate that into a protagonist who is also an outsider, with an understanding, like I have an understanding of French language and culture, but with gaps as well, and the need to learn and to have that distance and to acknowledge that that I'm not an insider, and that so that was a personal reason. I felt it was a step back from imposing myself and saying, look, I know France so well that I'm going to pretend my protagonist is going to be a Parisian woman. No, I didn't feel comfortable taking that step.
That makes a lot of sense. I also think there's something in Lucie. I think maybe being an outsider, quote unquote, she doesn't ever, the idea of anti-Semitism always seems foreign to her, whereas to the people around her, especially to her uncle, it's far more ingrained, or maybe more natural, or maybe you could make a case for why Jews are bad people, or, the Eastern Europeans are bad people. To Lucie, it always seems wrong.
Yeah, and I think having grown up in Australia, I mentioned in the book at one stage that she has heard a vague mention of anti-Jewish sentiment from a Catholic priest at one stage. But, this is Australia in the 1930s. She lives in a tiny little rural village in Australia. She doesn't even live in a big city. So it is a very foreign concept to her. There were very few migrants, non-English migrants in Australia at that stage. And so she wouldn't even have been exposed to migration from Europe. There were large waves of migration, but after the war. So she wouldn't even have had much of an understanding of this long history of migration within Europe and out of Europe as well. Of course, and also having been brought up in 1920s and 1930s Australia, she wouldn't even have been exposed to the history of colonial invasion of Australia and the massacre of Indigenous Australians either. So even though that had gone on, and Australia had, she says at one stage, our country's never been invaded. Of course it has, by white people, the English invading and exterminating Indigenous Australians. But that is not something that would have been taught back in the 1920s and 30s to a young rural, student in the school there. So she is very much an innocent and doesn't come with all that baggage of the understanding of the history of French anti-Semitism. So I wanted for her to be exposed to that, and I think that's why she is more shocked, I suppose, than the average Parisian young woman of 16 at that time.
Yeah, I think that's true. If you're never told that you're supposed to hate a group of people, then you don't understand why that's happening.
Exactly.
Are you as obsessed with French food, wine, and cheese as I am? If so, you may be interested in the Terroir podcast. Hosts culinary journalist Emily Monaco and chef and wine expert Caroline Connor explore the links between the foods, wines, and more to the places they're from and the people who make them. Listen now to the Terroir podcast on parisundergroundradio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. One of the themes of your novel is the long-lasting effects of the horrors of war. Mm. And we see that a lot in the older generation of men in the book. Lucie's father, for example, never gets over it, and it ends up becoming, quite traumatic for him in his life. And Lucie's uncle has become quite hardened and callous because of it. And Eileen's father, Eileen being the best friend, we still don't really know what happened to him. So why was it important to you to integrate the effects of the First World War into this one? Because I've read a number of books about this time period, and this is the first book where I've really seen how the aftershocks of the First World War were so abundant in the Second World War.
Yeah, I think there's a direct link. I mean, really, when you think about the beginning of the Second World War, it was 20 years after the end of the First World War, and that's like 2002 to us. It's such recent history. And yes, some of the young veterans of the people who had been young in the First World War were still eligible to be conscripted and sent off to the Second World War, although so many of them had died and been seriously injured that a lot of them were exempt, like Gérard, the uncle, for example. He was too old and he had been injured as well. But I think, so there was the direct effect on the men who had participated, the foot soldiers who had participated, and the scars on both sides as well. I mean, I think there's not much of a focus in my particular book on the effect on the German population of having lost the First World War and the soldiers there and the humiliation. And of course, there's been a lot written about Hitler's motivation for war as well, and the need to take revenge over the humiliation that had been imposed both in the war and in the period between the wars, the economic situation that was terrible in Germany. So I think there are lots of direct links between the First World War and the Second World War. I wanted to focus just briefly on the actual men, the foot soldiers and the impact on them, because with Gérard especially, I think it's very complex. His attitude towards the Germans, it can seem a little contradictory that he is almost collaborating and with them, but justifying it. I won't give away too many spoilers, but, stealing from them. And he has a very complex relationship with the occupation because he is very pro-Pétain, pro-collaboration, anti-Semitic, but vehemently anti-German as well. So he finds himself in a very difficult situation, and he finds his own justification through the actions that he carries out. He feels that he's balancing his different loyalties and antagonisms through the way he's doing that. But I also think, there were so many deaths in the First World War, and there were deaths even related to the aftermath of the war through the Spanish flu and malnutrition. And Gérard himself lost his wife and young daughter just after the Second World War. And so I think that trauma as well of the difficulty of recovering from one war fed directly into the justification for a second war, but also those very difficult decisions that people had to make about how they would then behave, faced with these new circumstances of another war. So it's not the focus of the book, but I did want to, because my protagonists are mainly female, I didn't want to ignore the impact and the input of males, because it was very, very important. Even though there were very few males actually of, fighting age in Paris, because there were 2.5 million, I think, prisoners of war. And so all those young men were absent from France, and that had huge consequences as well for how Parisians and Parisiennes reacted to the occupation, because there were mainly young boys and older men left here in Paris, and women suddenly were put into these positions, into roles that they hadn't previously had opportunities to experience, working, for example. But at the same time, the Vichy regime was really imposing very traditional roles on them of being mothers and loyal wives. and waiting for their husbands to come back. So it's a fascinating period for women as well. So I touched on that as well. There were so many things that I could have integrated. It's really difficult. It's such a rich and complex period. So it's very difficult to know what to focus on. But hopefully I've woven enough strands in there to interest people, and for people, if they are interested in that historical period, to go off and research, what was really behind these things that I've mentioned briefly in the novel.
Well, I really appreciated that because I feel like so often World War II is treated as its own bubble.
Mm-hmm.
And at least in the US, there's this narrative that the French surrendered immediately and they were cowards. But the truth is, it was only 20 years between the two world wars, and the First World War wiped out everyone. There was no one to fight in the Second War. And whereas I don't personally agree with the Vichy regime, I do understand why people would say, okay, let's not slaughter everybody else. Let's try to come up with some kind of compromise here.
Yeah, and that was the justification that Pétain used.
Mm-hmm.
When he turned Paris over as an open city, and to avoid the destruction of Paris and to stop the war, to avoid further massacres. That was his justification, that he was, saving the French population. Unfortunately, what he didn't acknowledge is that down the track, through his collaboration, he was also sacrificing a part of the French population. But, that fitted in nicely with the overall, political aims of the right-wing and extreme right-wing regime at the time. There had been a big movements towards anti-Semitism even before the war. So when the Germans were imposing the anti-Jewish measures, it was a continuation, really, of an acceleration, but a continuation of existing policies.
Yeah, and even in your book, the two main characters, Lucie and Aileen, they run into German soldiers and they also run into the French gendarme. And we see, I think, oftentimes a more human side from the Germans, who are playful and kind, and the French gendarme, who are pretty cruel and, more cutthroat, I think.
Especially during the roundups. And, I did a lot of research. There's a lot that was written by the Parisian population about their interactions with the Germans. And the adjective that they used most often in describing them was correct, which in French doesn't exactly translate into correct in English. It's just they were civilized and comme il faut, and they had nice interactions with them. Because a lot of the officers who were posted to Paris, they were Francophiles. They loved French language and art and culture and history. And so they were thrilled to be here. They probably would have wished to be here under different circumstances, but, they're just regular army German soldiers. A lot of them were very civilized in their interactions with non-Jewish French people. And so I wanted to report on that and give a glimpse into some of those interactions that I'd come across so often in the archives that I was reading.
So Lucie is an artist, and she's often compelled to draw sketches of the faces of the people that she meets. And she takes these drawings and folds them up and leaves them in public places for passers-by to perhaps one day happen upon. Where did the inspiration for that idea come from?
I don't know about, the inspiration, I guess, is from my personal life. When I arrived in Paris, I did something similar. I'm not a professional artist. I've always loved to sketch people. I'm a little out of practice now, but I was quite good at it back then. And coming from Melbourne, it's quite a big city, but it was still a bit of a shock to the system to be in Paris and just to be in crowded metros and, the streets always full of people. And so it was my way of just taming Paris a little bit, was to sit quietly and observe people and sketch them. Because, I was a young woman back then, I was in my early 20s, and so you were often kind of bothered by men, when you were sitting in a park. But if I had my little barrier, little sketchbook, I could hide behind that. And so I often did sketch people. I didn't fold them up and hide them around Paris. So that was one inspiration. But the reason, in my mind, why Lucie does this is because she's noticed, especially when she first arrives in Paris, it's before the occupation. So she gets a little glimpse into this beautiful city and Parisian life, and terraces full of people having cafes and talking in the streets. And then after the occupation, and as the years go by, she sees people becoming wary and suspicious and withdrawn and isolated. And so her idea is to draw these strangers, fold it up, hide them around, and as you say, hopefully passers-by will find them. And by looking at this stranger's face, perhaps ask themselves, who is this person? What are they going through? What is their life? What is their story? And perhaps try and recreate a little bit of empathy in a city that's become very hostile and wary and suspicious. Perhaps this little glimpse into a stranger's life will plant a little seed in the mind of the person who sees the face and might create a tiny, tiny thread of empathy or curiosity about a stranger. So that's the reasoning behind her little activity there in her head.
In your novel, many of these acts of rebellion, and certainly one of the earliest and the most overt, is organized by students. And at one point, Yvonne, Lucie's mother, says that in the beginning she thought these students were foolhardy, but in the end she was able to see they were right. So was it true that these protests were organized by students?
Yeah, it was the first act of resistance, really, and they were university students and high school students as young as 14, 15. So the first 11th of November, I'm not sure what it's called in the States, but so the first Remembrance Day, we call it in Australia, the 11th of November to mark the end of the First World War, all commemorations were banned. It's normally a public holiday. The public holiday was cancelled. And usually there would be a procession and a wreath laying at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier under the Arc de Triomphe. So that was banned by the German authorities. And so students in high schools and universities started saying, well, no, we're not going to obey. We're going to resist. And so they started circulating little handwritten and printed tracts around through schools and universities saying, let's all gather. We'll march down the Champs-Élysées. We will gather in front of the Arc de Triomphe and we will lay our wreath at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. And so they did do this. And unfortunately, it was violently repressed by the Germans. There were students arrested, shot, injured, including 14, 15-year-old high school students who were then tried and deported for this very first act of resistance. So, yep, that's a true story. It's not particularly well known. That if you Google it, there's a Wikipedia page and things like that on it, but it's a really heroic act from young people. When at that time, older people, adults, were still, Paris had only been occupied for about 6 months. They were still working out how they were going to live with this new situation and how they were going to react. But young French students, being French students, decided, no, we are going to demonstrate. We're not going to be silent.
Yeah, very interesting. I feel like that happens historically often, that it's the students that have the courage to go do something about it first.
Exactly.
Is Paris the most romantic city in the world? Host Lily Heisey answers this very question in her podcast, Romancing in Paris, which takes you through the city, arrondissement by arrondissement, by exploring the most romantic and hidden spots Paris has to offer. Listen now to Romancing in Paris on parisundergroundradio.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. So I think you're going to read a little excerpt of your book for us. Is there anything that we need to know contextually before you do?
Yeah, so the extract that I'm reading is set just after the German invasion of Paris. So when the Germans arrive from the north and arrive in Paris, Paris is turned over to them. It's declared an open city. The French government has fled to Bordeaux. In fact, they actually asked the American ambassador to remain and to welcome the Germans. There were no representatives of the French government when Paris was handed over. Yeah, that's another little interesting tidbit I discovered. And so this provoked, when the French population heard that the Germans had come across the Maginot Line and were making their way down towards Paris, it provoked a huge exodus. Up to 8 or 9 million people were on the roads. I think it's the biggest exodus in the history of humanity, all at once, 8 or 9 million people on the roads heading south, trying to keep ahead of the German advancing troops. So this happened. My protagonists head off, and once the armistice is signed, little by little people start coming back and realizing they can come back to Paris, and it'll be an occupied city, but they can come back, and it's not a city at war. And so this extract happens as Lucie, her mother Yvonne, and Lucie's uncle Gérard drive back into Paris and find it occupied by the Nazis.
As the van rolled past the Champ de Mars, a single ray of sun broke through the heavy evening clouds. It shone like a searchlight on the flag fixed to the top of the Eiffel Tower. The fabric stretched itself out, a scarlet slap against the muted purple of the early autumn sky. At its centre glowed a circle, white as death. Lucie squinted at the thick black symbol deformed in the folds of flapping cloth. One moment they looked like eyes and a mouth narrowed in anger, the next like arms raised in stiff salute. She'd first seen the huge black swastikas in newsreels of Hitler and his Nazi party, his rallies at Nuremberg, the Olympic Games in Berlin. At the time she'd found the symbols harsh and ugly. Here, the bloody redness of the flag was even more disturbing. She peered through the van's dusty windscreen as they crossed the Pont de l'Alma, drove along the Avenue Montaigne, and advanced slowly down the long tree-lined avenue of the Champs-Élysées. Behind the wheel, Gérard was silent, his jaw uncharacteristically slack. From the corner of her eye, Lucie noticed the skin under his chin, loose and trembling with the jolting of the wheels on the cobblestones. As they arrived on the Place de la Concorde, Lucie turned towards the National Assembly building on the other side of the Seine. A giant white V had been fixed to the ornate stone pediment. Below, a banner stretched across the row of massive columns. In huge black letters it declared, Deutschland siegt an allen Fronten, Germany victorious on all fronts. As they rounded the empty square, more red flags came into view, huge and glaring, covering the delicate stonework of theatres and hotels. Along the Rue de Rivoli they hung one after another, aligned and spaced with military precision, thick branding irons stamped on the city's skin. Gothic-lettered street signs, black on white, pointed to new and fearful-sounding landmarks. Commandant von Groß Paris, de Militarbefehlshaber. Lucie pinched the inside of her forearm and twisted till it ached. This isn't a nightmare, a voice inside her head repeated. This is real. This is real. Despite the warmth of the September evening, the avenues and boulevards were deserted. The streetlights had been painted blue as a precaution against air raids. They created an impression of a city submerged. The streets were silent. The only sound the creak of a handcart pulled by an old woman disappearing under the arches of the long arcades. And then she heard it, the click, click, click of the boots of a German patrol echoing off the stone facades. Lucie craned her neck and peered along each side street as they drove past, but the source of the sound remained hidden from view. As the sun turned the sky from pink to orange, the van cut in front of the Louvre and crossed the Pont Royal. On the far side of the river, she noticed that the clock on the Orsay railway station was an hour fast. When she mentioned it, Gérard replied sullenly that it had been set to Berlin time.
Fabulous. So what's next for you? Do you have another book in the works?
I do. I've just started work on another novel. It won't be historical fiction. It'll be contemporary fiction and set in Australia. But I'll be weaving in some of my personal experience. When I was young, I did a play in the Central Men's Prison of Melbourne, which was quite an experience. I spent 4 months there.
Wow.
With the prisoners. The prisoners were the theatre group.
Oh, wow.
And they needed females. And so I had this very, very interesting experience of getting to know the prison system and the prisoners over a period of 4 months. And so I'll be writing the story of a prisoner, an escaped prisoner, and an old woman who meet up and go on a bit of a road trip together. First of all, as a hostage, the woman is a hostage, but little by little she decides to help this prisoner. So it'll be very, very different to Small Acts of Defiance, but I'm excited. I'm excited about writing it. I have, yeah, and I'm learning so much as well, because I know that, I know the mistakes I made in drafting the first novel, and which little by little I had to untangle and get into shape with the help of an editor. So hopefully I'll avoid some of those this time. Although I talk to a lot of my novelist friends and they say, "No, every novel is like. It's like starting from scratch. It's like starting back at zero, like as if you've never written a novel before. So I'm optimistic that it'll be a little bit easier this time, and but it could be just as difficult. But yeah, I'm up for a challenge, and I'm still writing short stories at the same time. I'm still writing short stories and getting them published in anthologies and things like that. But yep, definitely tackling another novel.
Very exciting. So where can people find you if they want to keep up to date with your writing?
Well, I do have a Facebook account, so Michelle Wright Author, and I'm on Instagram. I'm not really, really good with all the social media stuff, so I don't post very, very often. But if people send me messages via Instagram or Facebook, I definitely respond. But if they're hanging out for my daily posts, they could be waiting a few months between posts. But whenever I have any big news, I that's where I'll put it. Yeah. But I definitely love to hear from readers. Whether it's via Goodreads or Facebook or Instagram, I love to hear what people think. Even if they don't love the novel, that's fine. I'd really love to enter into that dialogue, because it's such a long process writing a novel and so solitary that once it's out there and it's a living thing and you're it's not really complete for me until someone has read it and interpreted it and given me their reaction to it. So yeah, I'd love to hear from people.
Have you been able to do any public readings or touring or anything with this novel?
It was very difficult because it came out in Australia in June 21. So Melbourne had a long period of lockdown. And so there was a tiny, it came out during a lockdown. Everything was cancelled. There was a tiny period of a couple of weeks where we just briefly came out of lockdown, and I was able to do a little event with 30 people face-to-face with masks on. And then I had to cancel my launch 5 times. Eventually, in February this year, I just had a celebration. It wasn't a launch because it was 9 months after the book came out, but I just had a celebration with family and friends to thank them, and that was lovely. But yeah, it's been really difficult, not just for me, for so many authors, with festivals cancelled and author talks and everything. Did a lot online, which was lovely, but it's not the same as being there in the room with people. So hopefully for the next one.
I think you're right too that it's very important to have some sort of celebration to mark the ending of this process, this enormous process.
Yeah, and to move on to the next one. Now I feel it's actually I've officially launched it, and I can focus on the next one as well.
Fabulous. Well, I'm going to include links to your social media so people can find you really easily. And thank you so much, Michelle. This was lovely. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me.
It's been lovely chatting to you too, Jennifer. Thank you.
Thank you again to Michelle Wright for such a lively conversation. You can find Michelle on Facebook at Michelle Wright Writer and on Instagram at Michelle Wright Author. Please join me next week for the season finale of Season 3 of Storytime in Paris. My guest will be author Sabine Durand. Check back next week to see if your questions have been answered and to hear a reading from her book, Sun Damage. If you'd like to keep the conversation going, please join the Storytime in Paris book club, where you'll meet a different guest author each month and get to speak with them directly about their work. For more information, please visit patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity, and you can find me on all socials at Jennyphoria. That's JennyPhoria, and on my website, jennyphoria.com. Storytime in Paris is produced by me as part of the Paris Underground Radio podcast network. To check out interviews with previous guests or to discover more great Paris-based podcasts, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thank you, and until next time, happy reading! This episode of Storytime in Paris was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more on this show and shows like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com.